For more on what a Labor victory might mean for the property market, Grant Thornton's National Head of Real Estate and Construction, Sian Sinclair, joins us live from our Brisbane studio. Sian, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time on the show today. As we know, Australians are heading to the polls on the 18th of May, and if the opposition Labor Party were to get in, they are proposing some big changes to tighten up on those tax concessions for property investors. What are your thoughts about the implications if in fact they do come into play? Do you think that could invite further house price weakness?
Well, Leanne, thanks for having me. Look, I think if there is a change, at least we'll have some certainty then. We've had Labor have been very clear about their tax policies and what they're planning to change around negative gearing and the removal of the CGT discount, or sorry, halving of the CGT discount. So at least people will be able to make some decisions. At this point, there's a bit of a state of flux and people are hesitant to actually transact because they're just not sure what it's going to mean post-election. We've now been given a date for an introduction of those proposed changes, and what we'll see likely is probably a bit of a flurry of activity if we do have a Labor government coming through, particularly in the established housing market. But the question is, what happens after that 1 January 2020 date in relation to, what level of activity are we going to see then in most investment decisions?
And it's also important to remember, look, it's not just investors that are impacted by some of these changes. It's important to remember that investors in all assets that are negatively geared will also be impacted, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, negative gearing is quite a fundamental part of the tax system that we've had for many years, and it relates to all investors. So it's not just the property market, which, whilst, those in the property market are taking the decision and the policy change very personally, of course, but it is also those who negatively gear shares or commercial property are also being impacted. So, let's think post the election and post 1 January 20, we've got a lot of investors who, if they are actually keen to get the benefits of negative gearing, might be switching asset classes. And if the intention is to lift the affordability for first home buyers, we've suddenly got them competing now with investors in traditionally other asset classes.
Yes. One of the asset classes, though, that could actually benefit, from negative gearing would be new residential properties, right? Because obviously we perhaps would see a bit of an influx on that front, and some of those new residential properties would become more attractive to buyers. That also then opens up the question about what it would mean then for, say, property developers, which have obviously also been under pressure with the decline in prices. But what do you think about that scenario from a developer's perspective?
Yeah, well, I like to think of it as if you think of a first-time investor who is getting into the market into residential property, they're now directed towards looking at new residential versus established. And when you're looking at an investment decision in property, it's a large decision. It's still an emotive decision. And so, when you're walking in to make a buying decision, there's the immediacy of walking into an established property that may already have tenants or someone living there, and you can put yourself in those shoes and decide that you could see yourself living there. You're comfortable that you'll be able to rent it and have some, a good return from that. Versus if you're looking at purchasing off the plan, or you're having to build a new property which has a lead time to completion, there's a bit of a cooling period there, and it feels like a bit of a riskier decision. So what that's going to mean for developers is, does that mean they need to have more completed stock waiting, ready to go for an immediate decision to be made on? And that the holding costs and that, it's just not commercial, it's not feasible, particularly in a market where it is tough to get funding and there's a level of pre-sales required to get projects off the ground.
An interesting announcement. I mean, obviously affordable housing is such a big talking point as well, and an interesting announcement Labor made was around affordable housing that dovetails with the changes to negative gearing, with the subsidies proposed to boost the supply of affordable housing. On that front, I mean, what does that mean in terms of, say, boosting sort of new and first homeowners?
Yeah, well, we've got policies from both sides of government. So whoever comes in, it's incumbent on them to deal with the issue around housing affordability. We have a growing population. People need we need more housing, and it's just a question of how do we encourage all levels of housing, because there are various social housing requirements that we need to provide in the community. And to date, we've really struggled in trying to find something that works. We've got Labor looking at rebates over a 15-year period, but of course the requirement is that you're renting the property at 20% below market value. So the question has to be raised is, does that investment still stack up? And so are smart investors still going to find that a desirable investment? I know the existing government, they had announced changes around providing an increase to the CGT discount for those properties which qualified as affordable, but announced back in 2017, and we still haven't seen it come through as law as yet. But regardless, either of the parties, whoever winds up in government, needs to make sure that affordable housing and a methodology that actually is going to create something that's desirable to investors if they are going to try and seek the investment from the private sector.
Just a final thought, Sian. I mean, we know that this is just one issue at play here for the housing market and the outlook for the housing market. Tighter lending criteria has really been one of the biggest factors as to why we've seen a decline since sort of mid-2017. I guess, you've got the other concerns around consumers and households, flat wages growth, and in the wake of the Banking Royal Commission, all those sorts of things. We were hearing from NAB today, they've actually, sort of reduced their forecast for falls, or it's got a little worse than what they were previously expecting. Now 20% drop from peak to trough. What is your outlook from here when we combine all of those factors? What do you think will be the catalyst perhaps for a further fall from here, or what are you predicting?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not hard when all those things you've listed off. It's no wonder that people's confidence is down. So whatever the government can do to provide clarity, certainty, and to give people the ability to actually make decisions around these large transactions is going to be of benefit. We've seen, the banks are still offering products out there, but the hurdle rates to get into those and who can qualify for those is probably what has changed. What we want to see is, when it comes to addressing the issue of housing affordability, whatever levers they have to pull, and there's not that many at the federal level other than the tax sledgehammers that have been offered at the moment, is really gaining cooperation from the state governments, because the state governments and the local governments, they also play a lot into the housing affordability issue around land supply and around infrastructure charges. So we really need to see collaboration of all levels of government addressing this issue. So whatever the government of the day can do to try and garner that collaboration to address the issue is a benefit.
All right, fantastic. Look, it will continue to be a hot button issue over the next 5 weeks heading into the federal election. Sian Sinclair, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thanks for having me.